I'm going to propose an idea that is very exciting to me. For a long time, we've had some notions about what might cause teenagers or even adults to head toward some kind of violent or criminal activity, what we would call risk factors, and on the other end, what we would call protective factors. But what we haven't really had, and what an app that I think would be really helpful, would be something that lets us measure and track how an individual teenager, let's say, is at risk or is protected for a particular, for a problem. And that we can put in the risk factors and the protective elements and see who's at risk. And I call this app Crisis Corpuscle. Now, one thing we see right away is it makes you wonder, what the hell is that? And what is this app? But I like a title that raises some curiosity, not your average title. So what is a corpuscle anyway? A corpuscle is a blood cell that rushes to the site of some kind of injury or wound that we might have in our bodies. And this Crisis Corpuscle is an app that can notice when someone may have been wounded or at risk and can rush some kind of support to that individual who might need help. So it's not an app that's going to assume or jump to conclusions about people or force any kind of action, but it's more like an awareness kind of thing that might trigger more investigation and exploration about how a teenager is doing, and also offer some options for how to help them, potentially. So my notion is that we would feed into it everything we know, or a lot that we know, about risk factors and protective factors. So one study, for instance, in 2001, listed a bunch of, for instance, risk factors for violence of teenagers. For instance, the history of violent victimization, when they've been the victim of some kind of crime, that's a big risk factor. Someone who's been abused tends to abuse again. Someone who's been bullied tends to bully. Certain kinds of disorders, like attention deficits or hyperactivity or learning disorders, are somewhat of a risk factor. Seeing early aggressive behavior in a child, involvement with drugs, alcohol, or tobacco, showing poor behavioral control or impulse control, high emotional distress, history of treatment for emotional problems, exposure to violence and conflict in the family. Other things that are family risk factors, like authoritarian child-rearing attitudes or harsh, lax, or inconsistent discipline practices, low parental involvement, parental substance abuse or criminality, poor family functioning, and then peer factors like social rejection by peers, isolation, association with delinquent peers, poor academic performance, low commitment to school and school failure. And there are community factors too, like diminished economic opportunities, high level of family disruption, low level of community involvement, socially disorganized neighborhoods. So those are just some examples of things that if we had a question about a particular teenager, or a school had this app, or a counselor had this app, if we could build in a way of measuring and tracking some of these things, or getting input even from a variety of sources onto the app, so it's not just one person looking, but it's coming from 3 or 4 places. What do the parents say? What do the guidance counselors say? What do the teachers say? We could create a picture. The picture might also include protective factors, things that might mitigate against a problem. If the family has an intolerant attitude toward deviance or acting out, if there's a high grade point average, if there's an active, positive social orientation, if there's a religious sense in the family, that can make a difference. If there's connectedness to family or adults, if they can discuss problems with their parents and share activities with parents, So these are things that we could put in as protective factors. So we end up with, rather than having kids that are that we don't know, they've been sort of in the shadows, they've been suffering without being seen or observed, and then, how could they act that way? What was going on? This app could actually trace and track and get a kind of measure of how at risk a teenager was, or even an adult, and then could list a bunch of strategies, a bunch of resources, a bunch of readings, a bunch of techniques that parents and teachers could use to try to rush that corpuscle help to that area of crisis. So because there is a lot of knowledge about risk factors, and they are, some of them, things that could be reported or observed and measured, it seems to me that a place to gather that all together to bring help to kids at risk and notice them more and come to their aid more might be very useful. One other factor to mention is that there could easily be a very physical or brain-oriented component to this, along with the social and familial and economic, educational. So we could be taking a look at medical information from doctors, particular kinds of physical problems kids have. We could be measuring stress levels. We could look at cortisol levels and adrenaline levels. Information not only from doctors, but nurses, or even some of the new kinds of gathering information that you can do with your iPhone or your Samsung phone, or new watches that are coming out. So we can take a look at the physical state and chemical state and physical symptoms that kids are going through, and use that for some very specific data to add in. And out of all of this, we don't, we don't jump to a definitive conclusion, but we're looking to see where is help needed. And maybe some help is needed, we don't quite know why, we don't know how, but we're identifying the presence of risk factors and some symptoms, and having the consciousness now, bringing all those factors to bear in one place, one app, to try to identify these kids and help them.